The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, you know, in the colonies, the colonial elite, looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants, who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up, and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another, or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who were enslaved Africans and these quote-unquote white folks who were poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all getting played by these rich people. Right? So ultimately, the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans, right? Because at least they look like you. They sort of share some of the customs and the culture. So they all of a sudden create this thing called whiteness, and they say, now you're part of the club. Now we're going to let you testify in court, enter into contracts, vote, at least if you're a man, own a little bit of land, at least if you're a man, right? And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that, because you're too good for that. And we're going to take the white men, now called white men, and put them on the slave patrol to keep black people in line. Give them a horse and a gun and a badge and make them feel big and powerful, right? They're still poor. They still don't have anything. They didn't pay the slave patrol well, right? Just exploited them, used them as a buffer between the elite and the other poor folks, particularly poor folks of color. And pretty soon, the rebellions that occasionally happened where black and white got together to overthrow the elite, those stopped. Because the divide and conquer had begun to work, right? You could turn people against each other by telling those poor white folks, they got to keep these black people in line. And so that divide and conquer gets initiated in the colonies. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward to the Civil War era. And you have, I'm from the South, right? My people, the elite in my part of the country, right, actually announced that the reason they wanted to break away from the Union and possibly go to war with their brothers and sisters to the north was in order to maintain slavery and white supremacy. They said that at the time. We lie about it now. And we say it had nothing to do with that. But of course, at the time, they didn't have any shame about it, so they just said it openly, right? The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new government was the great truth that the Negro was not the equal of the white man. So that's the reason the Confederacy was formed and existed. But here's the trick. If I'm rich and I want to go to war to protect my ownership in other human beings, my property, but you're poor and you don't own any enslaved people, why the hell would you go fight to protect my stuff? Because I'm a rich person. I'm not going to fight. Rich people don't go to war, right? Rich people get poor people to go to war for them, whether it's in 1860 or whether it's during the 1960s or whether it's today, right? Rich folks get doctors to write notes for them that say that they have heel spurs, and that's why they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that shit because he's sitting in the White House right now, right? Oh, I can't go fight. I have heel spurs. Send some poor kids to do that for me, please, right? So that's been a long-standing tradition. So the rich have to figure out a way to convince the poor to go fight for them. But that's a hard thing. That's like a hard sell, right? Like, how the hell, why would you do that? Why would you go fight to protect my property rights when you don't own anything? The only way you would do it is if that rich person comes to you and says, hey, listen, you gotta go fight because we gotta maintain our way of life, because if these people get free, they're gonna take your jobs. No, fool, they already got your job. That's how it works, right? Because if I'm white and I gotta charge you $1 a day to work on the farm, but you can get a black person to do it for nothing because you own them. Guess who got the job? Free got the job, right? So in a sense, poor white folks would have been better off joining with black folks to overthrow the slave system. That would have raised the wage floor of all working people. But they got tricked by rich white men telling them that their enemies were black and brown. Fast forward to the 1930s. And you have white labor leaders. They're not even the elite, right? The labor leaders are not the elite, but they're the elite within the labor movement. And even they had fallen for it at this point. So they didn't want to integrate their unions. And they would say things like, well, we can't have black people and Mexicans and Chinese folks in our unions because if we do that, it's going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. We have to maintain the integrity of our profession. No, fool, you need more people in the damn union is what you need. And if you don't let those folks in, guess what happens when you go out on strike? Who is the boss going to use to replace you? They're going to replace you with the very same black and brown folks that you didn't want to work next to, right? And so at the end of and then you're going to blame them for taking your job rather than the white rich dude for giving it to them, right? Divide and conquer, telling not rich white folks that their enemies are black and brown. And now we fast forward to the president. We got the president of the United States becoming president on the basis of that same rhetoric, telling not rich white folks that the reason they don't have a job is because Mexicans took them. Right? That's the argument. Keep in mind, there's been a net outflow of Mexican folk from this country, out of this country in the last 10 years. Right now, border crossings and actual in-migration at the lowest level they've been since the 1970s. So anybody who believes that is a damn fool or somebody who does not understand how to do research on the internet or someone who doesn't care, right? But he says the reason you don't have a job is those brown folks took them. I got an email from a dude said this to me it's like 3 years ago, young dude, and I knew it was gonna be crazy because it was all capital letters and right? Don't send me. If you don't like me, I don't care. It's fine. I'm a grown man. I don't really need your love or your support. But just don't send me a damn email with all capital letters. Like you can keep the cap lock off and tell me to go to hell. You don't have to scream it. Right? But this kid was screaming it, and he says, I can't find a job. Oh, Jesus, I can't find a job because black and Mexican folks took them all. Really? Blacks and Mexicans took all the jobs, all of them? Right? Then how is it that black folks and Latino folks are significantly more likely than white folks to be out of work? If that were true, why is it that black folks with a college degree are twice as likely as whites with a degree to be out of work? Latino folk with a degree, 50% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree, 23% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Our indigenous brothers and sisters with a degree, 2/3 more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. So I don't know where these people of color are taking all these damn jobs, but I know they are not taking them far. It's like they took them a block and a half and were like, yeah, I don't like that job anymore. I'm done with it, right? But this kid was convinced that's why he couldn't find work. Now, it's sort of ironic, though, because like the next paragraph is the paragraph where he told me that blacks and Mexicans are all lazy. All right, which is it? Because it can't be both, right? Because like if you took all the jobs, I'm pretty sure you're the opposite of lazy. That takes a lot of energy, running around from job to damn job. You can't be lazy and do that. And if you are lazy, I'm pretty sure you didn't even take one job, let alone all the damn jobs. I have this image in my head when people say this, right? Black people taking all the jobs. I have this image of like some farmer in Iowa getting up at 4 a.m. to milk the cows, right? And he walks out to the barn, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cows. And he gets out there, and, well, these cows have already been milked. Who did this? And then some black dude pops his head around the barn and goes, I did it! I took your job. That doesn't happen. Like, why would anybody believe it? But if a president or a presidential candidate says it, right, and you're hurting and you are out of work, it's easier to blame that scapegoat than it is to figure out that the global economy isn't made for you, isn't made for working people, whether they're black, white, or otherwise, right? It wasn't Mexicans that jacked up Wall Street. It wasn't black folks that destroyed the banking industry. That was just rich, high SAT having white boys. That's who did that, right? It was white men with college degrees and business degrees and high test scores. They're the ones that stole or lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money. And they did all that in 18 months, destroyed the economy. There wasn't a Mexican person in the room, documented or not, right? There wasn't a black person within 50 yards of any of them, right? There were no Asian Americans, no indigenous people, very few, if any, Muslims in the room. It was just white, probably, just dudes that just real smart, and so smart that they lost all that money or stole it or squandered it. And I know people get very uptight when I mention that they were white. Sometimes people are like, why do you have to point out that they were white? That's sort of racist. No, it's descriptive, right? And if they had all been black and brown, somebody would have pointed that shit out. Like if it was all black people and all Mexicans, I'm really confident that somebody would have said, no more banking jobs for blacks and Mexicans, right? If black folks had lost all that money, $12.5 trillion, I guarantee you no bank would have hired a black person for any bank job, not even like a teller job ever again. That would have been it. But white guys destroy the economy and they keep getting bonuses. How does that happen, right? Because we're blaming the wrong people. We're not blaming the people at the top for the job situation that that young man is facing and millions of other white folks are in fact facing. We're instead blaming the people at the bottom because it's what we've done for 400 years, right? Same thing with that border. Oh, we're gonna build a wall, that'll solve your problems, right? You think? Is that how capitalism works? Right? You think that's how capitalism works? You just build a wall and all of a sudden everybody gets a big fat raise? Is that what you think happens, right? Of course not. The corporate executives in this country are going to continue to move their jobs overseas. They can continue to send their jobs elsewhere, put their plant in another country because it's cheaper, because there aren't labor protections or environmental protections. Nothing's going to stop that. I know Donald Trump apparently thinks that sending out some really mean tweets at 3:30 in the morning will intimidate corporate executives. Corporate executives don't give a damn about his tweeting habits, man. 3:30 in the morning, Donald Trump sends out a tweet. If you got $40 billion of investment on the line, you don't give a damn what Donald Trump said. You're still going to move those jobs. Right? Those jobs are still moving as we speak. He takes credit anytime a company says they're not going to move. He ignores all the times that they continue to do so. Capital will always jump across borders under capitalism. Goods will always cross borders under capitalism. If you allow goods to cross and capital to cross, but you don't let labor cross, looking for a higher wage, guess what? The game is tilted against working people by definition. And not just working people down there, working people up here, who would actually be better off with a larger, more militant working class, fighting for better wages and working conditions for all people in the hemisphere, right? But we don't talk about that because we'd rather blame these folks. If we could just build a wall, everything will be fine, right? Not understanding both the humanitarian component of that, but also the practical component, because that's a cheap and easy answer, isn't it? It's a way of saying that we don't have to actually do the hard work of rebuilding an economy that works for everyone. So we have to understand the past in order to understand what's going on now. It's not just with the presidency, though. It's with the inequalities that you see when you look around. Like, for instance, if you don't understand the history of law enforcement misconduct in black space, in black communities, Black Lives Matter won't make any sense to you. Now, I want to be very clear when I talk about the history of law enforcement misconduct. I'm not talking about every damn cop. I'm not talking about good cops and bad cops, good people and bad people. I'm talking about a history and a culture of law enforcement that has simply not treated black and brown peoples the same as white folks. And anyone who denies that what I just said is true has not studied history and is not competent to speak about it, right? Because the history of policing traces directly back to slave patrols. That was the first iteration of law enforcement on this land in any real formal sense. It was police, after all, who enforced the slave codes. It was police who enforced segregation after slavery was ended. It was police who conspired to engage in lynchings of thousands of black bodies, releasing suspected criminals or people who weren't even suspected of a crime into the hands of the mob. It was police that pulled protesters off of sit-in stools in the 1960s. It was police that turned water cannons and dogs on children in the streets of Birmingham. It was police that did the same and beat protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. It was cops, along with uniformed military personnel, that rampaged in Mexican-American communities in Los Angeles during the Zoot Suit riots in 1943. That was law enforcement. It wasn't just average people. It was people whose job was to, quote unquote, enforce the law. The problem is, if you live in a society where the laws are unjust, everyone who enforces those laws is engaged in injustice by definition, you see? It's not about good people and bad people. It's about if a system is flawed, the people who enforce that system are culpable. And people of color know that, right? Black folks know, for instance, and brown folk know that it's law enforcement that enforces the war on drugs, which is not about drugs. And we know it's not about drugs. Two reasons that I know it. Number one, the data tells me. What does the data tell me? Every source you want to consult says that white folks use drugs and sell drugs and possess drugs at least as often, if not more often, than black and brown folks do. Right? Just as likely to possess, just as likely to use, just as likely to deal. But who gets arrested? We know it's black and brown folks, 5 times more likely on average to be incarcerated for drugs. African Americans, 4 times more likely to be busted for weed than white folks, even though usage rates for weed are virtually identical. So that's one way that we know it's not about drugs, that we know it's about controlling certain people. And if police are the ones doing that, then why are we surprised that black folks are cynical about policing, right? Why is that shocking? It shouldn't be. The other reason I know the war on drugs is not about drugs is that I'm standing here. And here's what I mean by that. If the war on drugs were actually about drugs, I don't know who'd be giving this talk, but I know it sure as hell wouldn't be me, because I don't think y'all would let me Skype this in from prison, and that's where I'd be right about now if the war on drugs were actually about drugs, and I can admit that because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit, so nobody can touch me now, right? No, I don't need like applause for weed. Like that's weird. Like you don't need to, woo-hoo, he used to get high. Woo, you know. No, it's all good. My asthma came back. I can't do that anymore. But, and I got kids. I'm trying to set an example. But my point is, right, if the war on drugs were really about drugs, myself and a whole lot of other white folks would be doing time, right? Because, I worked in public housing projects as a community organizer for about 15 months in the 90s, and I saw fewer drugs in public housing than I saw on a typical weekend on the 8th floor of the dorm where I lived my freshman year of college at Tulane University, uptown in New Orleans, right? I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing than I saw on a typical Saturday night in room 804, y'all, which I think was my room, but I can't be sure because drugs were involved, but you get the point, right? War on drugs isn't about that. So if law enforcement enforces the law that way, that's why people of color are going to look sideways at cops.